Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Financial Freedom Podcast. I'm Steve Richardson, a bankruptcy attorney trying to keep people on their path to financial stability and independence through education. As I've said in previous episodes, the earlier you start saving and investing for retirement, the better. As soon as you graduate with your degree and get a job, you should start on your path to long term financial freedom. But how do you get started? How do you put together a plan for retirement investment that will work long term? That's why in this episode of the podcast, I talked with retirement expert Ann Lester to get answers to this question. My guest today is Ann Lester, who is a retirement expert, author, media commentator, top rated speaker, and former head of retirement solutions for JP Morgan Asset Management, where she worked for almost 30 years. Ann earned an MA in International Economics and Japan Studies from Johns Hopkins and a BA from Princeton. She was awarded a Fulbright Graduate Research Fellowship as well. She also co founded the Aspen Leadership Forum on retirement savings with AARP, and her book, which is about to come out, Your Best Financial Life Save Smart Now for the Future You Want, which helps younger savers find long term saving success by overcoming their behavioral biases. So, welcome to the show, Ann.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, you work with mainly young people, people in their 20s and 30s. And of course, it's very important for people to start as early as they can in saving for retirement, because the earlier you start, the more time you give your money to grow before you need it. So that's very important. Uh, so I find that when it comes to establishing financial freedom, you need to start with mindset, your
Yeah.
attitude towards money before you really even get into any strategies or tactics or planning. You got to do the mindset. So I found from talking to other folks and from what I understand you do, people have different money types. Well, what is a money type?
So in my book, I think not so much about money types generically, but really spending types, which I think
Mhm.
connect right back to your money type. And, you know, I think a big bucket you can put people into is spender and saver. And I think, there are a lot more spenders out there than there are savers. But when you dig down into it a little further, I think there are a lot of different reasons why people feel like they can't control their spending or, maybe it controls them. And there's some behavioral patterns people fall into with how they spend their money that I think can tie back to some of those other mindset issues that you refer to. And also, I think this generation, right, especially people in their 20s and 30s, but I think it applies probably to everybody at this point. The rise of social media, the internet, like the way we use money is just radically different than it was certainly when I was growing up. In the 70s, I guess, when I first became aware of money. And, I had a passbook savings account and I have to go to the bank and get my money out. It was all cash, right?
Mhm.
When my kids were, in their early teens, they had ATM cards and, they could hook them up to their phones. So it's a totally different world out there today.
Mhm.
So the first type of spender I talk about in my book is the oversubscriber because these things just sneak up on you. You try the free trial, you say, sure, I'll remember to cancel it if I don't like it. And 3 years later, there you are still paying for something you never use.
Mhm.
And that's bad. It's also bad sometimes to be subscribing to things. I shouldn't say bad. It can be in conflict with your long-term financial goals
Mhm.
if you also are subscribing to a lot of things and you just don't really stop and think, do I really need all of this stuff, right? So, I think streaming services are classic where you watch one show once a year for a month. It said the woman who watches Ted Lasso on Apple Plus, and yeah, I'm paying for it all year. Like, really, do I really need to do that? I don't think so, right? But you just kind of slide into this behavior and don't. It's all little nibbles here and there,
Yeah.
so it's hard to grab them. So, that's just one example. But I think
Yeah,
about there's
we'll
sort of
we'll get into a lot of examples that a
yeah,
little later on, but in talking about these money types or money mindsets, and of course in the greater sense, I'm sure you can drill down with a little bit more specificity than spenders and savers, and there's some nuances to that. But all right, so we have these money types. How does someone understand what their money type is? And then once they know what it is, what do they do about it?
Well, I think one sort of way anybody can just do is, and this is the beginning of the year, right? It's a great time to pause and reflect, and you get those nifty little summaries from your financial services companies telling you what you're spending your money on. Is really think about, just sort of at a broad high level, when you look back at your spending, and it can be painful, right? But give yourself a little permission to acknowledge that maybe when you look back, you're going to see some stuff that you wish you hadn't done, or think, why am I doing this?
Mhm.
It's okay. We're all human. It happens all the time. Um, that's kind of what being human is, number one. But secondly, think about what that spending is reflecting about your values, right? When you think about, what are my values? How do I want to be spending my time? Where do I want to be putting my energy? Where do I want to be putting my money?
Mhm.
What is my money for, right? Obviously, it needs to keep a roof over your head and keep food in your stomach, but kind of beyond that, right? Money can do a lot of things. Is it actually lining up with how you want to be living your life and what your goals are? I think
Mhm.
that's a great place to start. And then as you dig down into some things, it can help you understand, am I actually spending money in ways that are goal aligned or value aligned for me, however I choose to define those?
Right. So, well, that's a good tactic. In other words, if you want to know what your money type is, look at your spending. Look at your bank
Absolutely.
balance, your credit card statements over the last year or two. How are you spending that money? And that
Hmm.
helps you to identify the type of spender you are and
Yep.
what your attitude is towards money. And then
Yep.
once you have an idea of that, you say, well, what is it you want to accomplish, both short term and long term? People have, in addition to long term savings goals like retirement, they have a shorter term savings goal, like maybe a down payment on a new car, or something they want a vacation they want to go on, or things like that. So they then need to adjust perhaps their money type or their pattern to be more in alignment with those goals that they've identified, right?
I think that's a terrific way to think about breaking down this really large, scary, like, I need to save. Like, what does that mean, right? Into very specific actions and steps and mental framing, right? That's a really helpful sort of technique, is mental framing. And we live in a old Queen Anne Victorian house that was the classic money pit,
Mhm.
arguably still is the classic money pit, but we spent a lot of money that we really didn't have, fixing this place up. And for a year and a half, I remember framing almost every decision I made in terms of replacement windows. This house has 53 windows. It's not a joke, 53 windows, and they're all custom. There's not a
Oh,
single standard window in this house. So if we had replaced them, which we ended up not doing, we would have had to have had a custom made window for every single opening in our house.
oh,
And the ones that all look the same size aren't actually the same size, because, it was 1900 whatever it was when they built them, and, machine tooling wasn't what it is now.
mhm.
So every time I thought about making a purchase, I was like, how many windows is that? That's half a window, don't need it, right? That's three windows, don't need it, right? And it really made it very concrete,
Mhm.
right? How I was thinking about, discretionary spending, right? Do I really need a new pair of shoes? No, that's a quarter of a window. Forget the new shoes, right? And it made it really tangible. And we
Mm.
ended up taking that money and using it to restore the old windows, which saved us some money. And I guess we like old things, right? So it felt better to us to save these 100-year-old windows. And as our architect said, they'll be good for another 100 years now. But um, it was still a huge amount of money we had to save up, and that it was
Mhm.
super helpful to think about trivial things, big things. We wanted a new TV. We're like, yep, that's two windows. Nope, we don't need that, right? It's a great way to make it smaller and make you feel like you're making progress towards this goal. So maybe it's your vacation you're saving for, right? Well, that's half an airplane ticket. That's two dinners out. Like, I don't need that thing that is attracting me in the moment. I have this other goal.
Well, that's a great example, a way of determining whether something is in alignment. You have a purchase you want to make. Is it in alignment with these larger goals? So that is, we're talking about to some extent short term stuff like the windows, or a vacation or whatever it is. But when it comes to saving for retirement, the longer term goals, it helps to have a plan for that too, and a longer term plan. What questions should people in their 20s and 30s be asking themselves as they plan their retirement goals?
I talk about this a little bit in my book, and I think one of the challenges is that especially when you're in your 20s and 30s, it's just like your brain is literally not wired to think about yourself in that future, right? It just
Mhm.
literally thinks about the part of your brain that lights up when you think about yourself more than 10 or 15 years in the future is the same part of your brain that lights up when you think about a stranger. So you literally on a very real sort of brain chemistry level don't think you're thinking about yourself. So these plans feel very unreal. You and I are just about the same age, right? So like, yeah, it doesn't feel so unreal to me right now anymore.
No.
But it's certain like when I was in my 20s and 30s, it was just like, what? Like I see my grandparents and they seem happy and have plenty of money, so it'll all be fine, right? I'll be just like them, right? Well, not really. And one of there are a couple of techniques you can use to make that future person feel more real. And there's just a whole bunch of great filters you can put on any phone picture you take of yourself, any selfie. That's these the aging filters. And that's one way to have your brain realize that it's still you, because even though you might be horrified, I'm horrified when I age myself 20 years. I'm like, oh my God, I'm gonna look like that. Um, but it helps make you feel emotionally connected to that future person. Thinking about older people in your lives, right? Whether they're coworkers or neighbors or grandparents or parents, depending on your age, is another great way to feel a little bit of emotional connection to that future self who's a stranger. And then the second thing that I think is very helpful is, again, thinking about big questions that you can't answer in your 20s and 30s, right? Where do I want to be living? What kind of life do I want to be living? How do I want to be spending my time, right? It's not as discrete or concrete as a window with a price tag on it, but it can help you visualize this future that you want to be doing. Maybe you want to be traveling more. I think that's a very common goal. Or maybe you want to have time to do a hobby that you love, right? You know how much those things cost now. So you can kind of do that same translation. It's a dinner out on vacation. Well, you can kind of do that same translation, except here's the other really cool thing. When you're in your 20s and 30s, if you save that money now, it'll be worth probably 5 times as much in 30 or 40 years, maybe even more, maybe even 8 or 9 times, depending on what the markets do. So when you say, well, I want to save for that $100 dinner, you don't need to save $100 today for that dinner, you're going to take on vacation in 6 months. It's actually, you need to save $20 today for that $100 dinner, right? Even with inflation. So it's a super powerful thing, and maybe we'll make it seem a little more digestible and manageable.
Well, that's the difficulty, of course, with long-term goals is that the 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 reward is further off. So you're not getting
And
that
and and the
positive
pain is
feedback.
immediate, yes.
Yeah. So yeah, you're saving for something, and that's people in their 20s and 30s have, as you say, a difficult time seeing the importance of it because it's
Right.
so far off. They see the importance. I need a car to get to work. I need a better car. I want to have a nice vacation this year because I need time off from work or whatever it is. So you see that, and that pain reward thing, those two are a lot closer together. So it can be more difficult to see those goals, certainly. Um, go ahead.
And it when you're in your 20s, right, compound returns take a while to really kick in,
Mhm.
because you're say you save $100, the math is easy, right? I'll say 10% return, which is probably a little unrealistic, but let's just use that number. So, because the math is easy. So 10% return on $100 is $110. Next year, you'll get a 10% return on a $110. So you'll get $11. The next year it'll be, so it actually starts literally snowballing, but it takes 10, 11, 15 years for you to really see that growth kick in. And then it's magic 20, 30 years on. But that's really slow at the beginning. So it doesn't nothing feels good about this at the beginning, right? You're causing yourself pain by not doing the fun thing you want to do right now for this stranger. Like, it's not fun, and it takes commitment, and you got to do it like anything, right? You got to do it for a little while to really start seeing the benefits kick in.
And it can be difficult too. I mean, even after you get the 10, 15 years on and you start seeing the money grow, it can be difficult, and you in bad economic times you don't want to log on to your account to see what it is,
Right.
because you're going to be depressed because you're going to see this dip, and it can be hard to stick to it and say, look, it's going to get better, it's going to recover, this is what the market does. But you need to have that resiliency to be able to withstand the short term dips that you see in the market in your long term savings.
The thing that I love to talk to people about, which again is a little, I think one of the challenges with money in general is that there's these weird jargony terms, and it involves, not complex math, but it involves math, right? Which is intimidating for a lot of people. One of the most powerful things to do to remind yourself that, the sun will also rise tomorrow, right? The markets will go back up, is just look at what we call in the industry rolling returns. So when you look at 1 year of return calendar year, right, you can see some really powerful, nasty drops. But if you even look at 1 year rolling returns, as soon as you shift off, anchoring on the very highest the market was to the very lowest bit, that starts smoothing out. And then when you extend those rolling time periods and start looking at rolling 5 or 10 years, and let's say, face it, if you're saving for a long-term goal, you're saving for at least 10 or 15 years, those rolling 10-year returns start getting a lot smoother and a lot less dramatic. And it's one way, before you have the sort of lived experience of living through those market bumps and crashes even, and seeing things come back. I've seen sort of 5 or 6 big market corrections in my career. So yeah, I know what happens. Even while you feel that, and certainly as a professional money manager, you really are focused on not letting that emotional response like drive the way you are investing other people's money.
Right.
But you still have that initial like, whoa, maybe it's this different this time. And you're like, it's not different this time. It'll come back. And
Mhm.
practice helps you manage those emotions, which is why I think sometimes older investors can sometimes be a little more uh, able to ride through some of that, but also you've got more money to lose, so it can also make the fear factor a lot larger. But before you have that experience, just looking back at history, and there's some cool little ways that you can see some of that animated. You can just look at the numbers and statistics. There are plenty of them out there, the pictures, right? It
Mhm.
can really help out a lot.
Well, I think, yeah, yes, with experience, as you get older and you see there is going to be recovery, this is not something to worry about. This is what happens. Maybe in the short term, for those in the 20s and 30s to think about it is, wait a minute, stocks are on sale,
Well,
50% off. Okay.
y- y-
So now's the time. This is great. You know what? If I put more money in when the market recovers, I'm going to get more than that 10%, because that stock that I bought on sale is going to bounce back up to previous levels, and I'm going to make a lot more money. So you start seeing that dip as not a bad thing, but an opportunity.
it's the scariest thing in the world, because your brain is screaming at you to sell when it feels bad and to buy when it feels good. And so what you
Mhm.
do is end up selling low and buying high, which is, the opposite of the way you make money, which is to buy low when things are on sale, as you say, and then sell high when everybody's going, oh my gosh, it's great, it's going to go to the moon. And you're like, yeah, I'm going to rebalance and take some profits here. Yeah. But that again is psychologically going against every sort of bit of survival wiring that we have in our heads.
And to remember, you haven't actually lost any money because you haven't sold anything.
Exactly.
So, you haven't like it'll come back to, and you don't need the money now. I mean, and particularly for people in their 20s and 30s to bear in mind is you're not going to need this money for another 30, 40 years. There's
That
plenty of time for it to come back. And if you buy them when they're on sale for them to zoom back up again, the opposite is, you get older and you may say, yeah, this happens. But when it happens when you're 63, and maybe you want to retire at 65 and you need to start using that money, that's where it can become a bit stressful.
You want to have a different conversation about the level of risk you're taking
Mhm.
and how you react to that risk when when you're close to or already taking some of it out and selling. But as you say so well, if you haven't sold it, you haven't actually lost any money, right? You only lose it
Mhm.
when you actually sell. And so the worst thing you can do is panic and sell, um,
Mhm.
especially if you're investing the way that I think most younger people, and actually probably everybody should be investing, not in individual companies, but in broad mutual funds or ETFs that get sort of very broad market exposure. Because the likelihood of, if you have all your money in one single company, you can look at a company that
Mhm.
seemed like a great idea, like Peloton, right? And maybe it wasn't such a great idea in hindsight, right? So it's possible that you actually would have wanted to sell that when it started going down, but those are pretty rare. And
Yeah.
that's why I think individuals spending a lot of time and energy and putting a lot of their money in one thing is a very scary thing to do. You're much better off. Um, I think just about anybody is better off with a much more broadly diversified pool of assets, because the likelihood of that whole thing like going belly up, right? It just that
Mhm.
the economies just broad economies, broad markets, the S&P 500, right, doesn't do that forever. It may have a rough
Mhm.
year or a rough month, right? That's not
Mhm.
a trend.
So also with the next question becomes, where do I find the money to invest? And
Yeah.
this is the question I think has a lot of young people thinking that they can't start saving for retirement. You know, they're just starting out in life. They've graduated from school. They may have some student loans they have to pay. They're not making the money they will later in life. So, look, I really don't have the money to invest. Well, when you're in your 20s, uh, $50 a month put away at 600 a year has, you know, 50 years to grow. And because it has that growth horizon, that long period of time, you don't need a lot of money when you're younger. And you need to be aware that every little bit counts. So let's talk about how to find the money. Um, and
I
from a
yeah.
mindset standpoint, I mean, we started talking about mindset. What are some of the ways to sort of hack your brain to make savings easier, depending upon your spending type? And does this change with money types?
One of the hardest things, uh, I'll personalize this. I talk a lot about some of these stories in my book. Like for me, was just learning how to spend less money than I made
Hmm.
and acknowledging that that was just a reality. And that, and part of it was the way I grew up, right? My parents were born in the 30s during the Great Depression, and, also grew up without any credit. Like credit didn't exist for my parents' generation. And credit cards really started becoming heavily marketed. When I was in college, there'd be these little, flyers in my student mailbox about you can sign up for a credit card. And I'm like, oh my God, it's free money. Like all I have to do is make that. I think many people in my generation like literally didn't understand how credit worked, and my parents never taught me really how to budget or how to manage credit, because guess what? They just were like, "Well, you just can't spend money you don't have, so what's there to talk about?" Like,
Hmm.
there's just why would we need to teach you? You're smart. You know that, right? And I was like, well, no, actually, I didn't know that. So I had a lot of trouble, in my 20s and 30s, frankly, kind of managing that
Hmm.
trade-off. And I think so from a mindset perspective, right? Getting your arms around the fact that you need to spend less than you make is hard, especially when you're in your 20s and especially when you're living in an expensive city and especially if you've got student loans to pay. Like it's actually a big ask. So
Hmm.
I would think about making sure that you think about this as a long-term goal. But maybe when you're 21 or 22, not putting yourself under enormous pressure to save a lot of money. Think about trying to find 1 or 2% of your budget. And I think thinking in percentage terms is especially helpful, even if it is only 50 bucks a month, right? Or
Hmm.
100 bucks a month, because that percentage, as you just flagged, right? As you grow older, it is almost certain that your income will be increasing with your experience. It also increases a little bit because of inflation, but you will get bigger raises than inflation over time in your 20s and 30s. It may not persist forever, but it will certainly in your 20s and 30s happen as you become more valuable to people who want to hire you. And the trick that I think is the most powerful, and people have won Nobel Prizes for it, is a thing called Save More Tomorrow, right? Where you literally commit to yourself to save, I think a great number is half of every raise, half of every windfall, half of every tax refund, half of every gift somebody gives you that's monetary, right? If you get in the habit of not allowing yourself to let your lifestyle, your consumption creep up with every additional bit of income you have, you will set yourself up for an amazing financial future
Mm.
because that's the money that, you're 21, save a teeny bit. We'll talk maybe in a bit about how powerful that can be if your employer is matching it in a 401k, but
Mhm.
save that teeny bit of money, maybe first in emergency savings, second in sort of a retirement account. And then even if it's just a tiny bit, the next time you get a raise, yeah, let yourself enjoy some of that raise because life would be very sad if you didn't, but not all of it.
Yeah.
That's the most powerful thing you can do, the biggest hack you can make. Can talk about some sort of tactical hacks you can make too, but the most powerful one is that commitment to yourself. And it really works because it doesn't cause you any pain in the moment.
Mhm.
Because your current present self is giving away money to that stranger that isn't really here like it's a future promise. So it's a very
Yeah.
easy promise to make. It's a little harder to do it, but if you've made that commitment and you maybe even figure out how to automate it, which you can in some circumstances, right? That's really powerful.
Now, and even these days, post pandemic, there's something else that can be powerful as well, and I've heard it called geographic arbitrage, where you're
Mm.
in the work from home environment. You can work in a low cost of living area for a company in a high cost of living area, and you're getting the salary of someone at that higher cost of living, but you're not spending as much, and that difference can be very powerful in making money and saving.
Yeah, I'm a little skeptical that that arbitrage will persist for a really long time. I think many more companies are really starting to demand that in-person presence, and I think companies are also becoming a lot more savvy to that arbitrage. And like, I know tech companies are doing this. Like, if you want to go live in that town, that's great, but then we're gonna adjust your salary. You get
Yeah.
paid that if you're in the Bay Area, right? So I do think that's maybe not something to bake your whole financial life plan on because I
Mhm.
suspect that won't persist. But there's a version of that, which is, I live in New Jersey. I'm in commuting to New York, right? There are a ton of very expensive suburbs here. And it's really easy to get caught in I call it the accidental spender, but this consumption creep, keeping up with the Joneses. I
Mhm.
have to do this because everybody's doing it. And you can kind of do a version of that arbitrage just by some choices you make about the kind or size or location of the house or apartment you're in,
Mhm.
by the kind of car you choose to drive, right? Really, it has to get you there safely. And do you really need the flashy wheels if you're, extending massively on credit to do them? Um, Dining out, I think, again, because of social media and because people can curate these sort of aspirational lives that they're sharing with friends and acquaintances on social media, it's so easy to start normalizing behavior that's crazy. And I just think about weddings as a place that this very elaborate sort of celebration has become normalized and just think, why? Like,
All that money, yeah.
why?
Mhm. Well, I think that what you say about geographic arbitrage, I think, yes, I think companies are going to start saying, well, wait a minute, you don't live in, we don't have to pay you that much because you don't live in New York, you live in South Jersey or something. But also, people need to bear in mind that when you're dealing with a virtual workforce, the talent pool is huge.
Yeah.
They're not limited. That employer is not limited to the talent pool within a certain radius of their location. They can recruit from all over the country, or really all over the world. And you start seeing that where you're competing with a lot more people, and it's going to become more difficult to get these remote jobs.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I managed a big team when I was at JP Morgan. I left as the pandemic was starting. So don't have that direct experience of managing that large team that way, but I am on the board of a couple of companies and just watching them kind of navigate this. One company basically started during the pandemic and was 100% virtual because that's what it was, but they've kind of gone to 3 days in the office, and another company whose board I'm on is really trying to drive there too. And I do think, I don't want to wander off topic too much here, but there's a real challenge for companies and managers because it is possible to manage totally remote workforces. There are plenty of companies that have shown that.
Mhm.
But how do you transition from one to the other if you already exist, to me, is a really difficult challenge. But that's maybe another conversation another day.
Well, yeah. So getting back to finding money as well, we started talking about this earlier with subscriptions. Uh, and I found, and you mentioned Ted Lasso, so you're an Apple person, but if you have an iPhone and you subscribe to this stuff through Apple, they'll keep track of those subscriptions for you.
Yeah.
You can go into your phone, you can see what you're subscribed to, what it costs per month, when it renews, and you can subscribe and unsubscribe from your phone. So that's a huge management tool when it comes to subscriptions and helping you keep track of all of these
Yeah.
and deciding, and go through it monthly. Am I really watching that much from this particular channel, from this platform? But what are some other ways in which people can uh, save money on subscriptions, and you talked about comparing a particular spend to how many windows that is.
So I think, again, the subscriptions, it's not just stuff on your phone, right? Or through the Apple or Android
Right.
universe. It's meal kits, it's, rent the runway, which maybe I haven't seen how many people are still doing that now that we're not all going to the office every day. It's, you name it, there's a subscription service. It's razor blades, it's ink cartridges from your computer, right? This stuff just is companies have figured out that subscription model is a much better way for them to make money, which means it's a much better way for you to spend money. So I guess just out of the gate, I think if you have the option to subscribe or not subscribe, you're better off not subscribing, even though they're theoretical savings, unless you really know you use X amount. I think the only thing I ever subscribed to, like, from an online shopping perspective, was cat litter, because that was really predictable and I knew I would always need it. But like, aside from cat litter, it's like, no, I'm not subscribing. I don't want this stuff showing up. I don't want to create this obligation to return it or manage another thing. It takes up too much headspace. Another one for me is just online shopping in general. Like, I'm bad at returning things. So I just don't I buy very little online because I'm terrible at returning things. So I end up accumulating stuff that I don't want. And it's just, I know I'm bad at it. Let's just not go there. So I think some things are figuring out where you are vulnerable to impulse spending,
Mhm.
and really figuring out how you need to be disciplined about not going there. Another tip I share is, this is not a reason to get multiple credit cards, right? Do not get multiple credit cards for this purpose. But if you happen to have two and you're signing up for a new subscription, please use the one with the shortest expiration date on it, because it will ask you to put your new information in. And that's a great way to say, wait, how much did I do this? What have I got this meal kit service? I don't use it. I end up canceling it. We were subscribing to this fabulous frozen seafood during the pandemic because I wasn't comfortable going shopping. And I looked in my freezer and realized I had 3 months of seafood kind of piling up in my freezer. And I was like, all right, we're stopping this one for a while because we're not eating it fast enough, right? So some of the stuff seems like a good idea. Very expensive words. It seemed like a good idea at the time. And you just have to figure out the best process for you for going back and monitoring that.
Mm.
But the credit card one, like the short expiration date, is kind of like the built-in safety around that, because it stops working. So I
Mhm.
love that as a little tip.
Yeah, I
I do
had
it
a
all the
couple
time.
of them that I didn't want to subscribe to anymore, and guess what? They came out and said, "Your credit card information, you need to update that." I'm like, "No, I don't."
Yeah, yeah, we're good.
That's a great way
Awesome.
to get rid of them because they're not gonna get paid. They'll cancel you. I don't need to do anything. But that brings up another point. A lot of times you need to look at how long-term are these subscriptions, because uh, in these subscription models, you've seen it, I've seen it, I'm sure our listeners have seen it. It's this amount per month or a lower amount billed annually. So you need to look at that difference and say, is that savings worth a 1 year commitment? Am I going to use it for 1 year where they're taking all the money now? Or do I want to see where I am on a month to month? Am I really going to use it? How easy is it to cancel?
Well, and I think that brings up a terrific point, which is scheduling, especially if you're what I call an ostrich who just doesn't want to think about this because it's just all a little too painful. Which, that's maybe a lot of us, right? See if you can book some time with your future self, like a weekend or, a
Mhm.
holiday is a great time to do it when you know you're not going to be distracted by other stuff. And just say, hey, I'm going to spend an hour or two just looking at this stuff. Doesn't have to be, I'm always struck by how these things that just seem like they're going to be nightmares and they're overwhelming and horrible. Like for some reason, sending out holiday cards is one of mine in my head. Like, it's gonna take all day. It took an hour,
Yeah.
right? Pulling my stuff together for taxes, I just dread doing it, and it's this awful thing, and I build it up in my head to be this nightmare, and it's like a rainy afternoon. Like, it's really not that big a deal. So maybe give yourself some boundaries so that it doesn't turn in. I only need to do this for an hour and then I can go do something fun, right? You give yourself a
Right.
time limit. You'll be surprised at how much of this you can knock off if you make it into a small, bite-sized thing. And instead of letting this sort of existential dread of you, I know I haven't been doing this right. It's so painful. I'm going to peek under the covers just a little bit.
Yep.
Is there a monster there? No. Oh my gosh, there's no monster. Wait, my time's up. I'm going to go do something else. Right. And it's a very powerful way just to get used to building the muscle of monitoring some of this stuff in an appropriate way without
Mhm.
necessarily allowing it to become obsessive.
Well, that's one of the parts of the 2 minute rule is
Yeah.
that I'm only going to do this for 2 minutes. And it works when you're, as you say, really fearful of having to do this. It's going to be an onerous task. It's going to take up all this time, and maybe you're stressing out because it hasn't been done, and you keep putting it off. And you get into it and say, "Oh, I'm going to spend 2 minutes," but once you're in, you're like, "Oh, this isn't so bad," and then you end up spending more time, more than 2 minutes. But that 2 minute intro to that task does two things. One, it makes you realize that it isn't as onerous as you thought. And two, it reduces the stress that's going around in your head of constantly putting that off and knowing that you have to do it. You just get it done.
Yep. No, I think that's a great one. I was doing that a couple weekends ago with our holiday decorations around the house. It's like, oh, it's going to take all after. It took an hour. I mean,
Yeah.
really, it's just not that hard. And it's a very useful thing to actually, before you get into some of these things, actually call some of these things up that you were dreading doing, whether it's cleaning your bathroom or like
Mhm.
these tasks that just seem horrendous. And then you're like, whoa, that was actually pretty easy. Yeah. Because a lot of this stuff is just not that bad once you start. And knowing is better than not knowing, and doing it is better than dreading it. But that initial
Mhm.
get into it, I love that 2 minute thing. That's a great tip. I'm going to use that one.
So, finding money, another way to find money that's easy, and it's listed as one of the biggest money mistakes people can make. I'm constantly seeing this in different articles, is not taking advantage of a 401k, especially
Yes.
where there are matching funds. You are getting 100%, an immediate 100% return on investment every time you have that money deducted from your pay because your employer is matching it. So that helps. But not everybody's employer has a 401k. So what do you do, and what steps should young people take, if their employer doesn't offer a 401k?
So I think there are a couple things, right? Just first, just to reiterate what you said, get the free money.
Mhm.
Please get all the free money. Make sure, even if you're juggling high interest rate debt, even if you're juggling, trying to figure out how you're going to save for a car or like something else you really need, get as much of the free money as you humanly can. Like that should be a number one priority. And then getting that free money will mean you can actually have much lower contributions in the future. And so it's a huge win. Like it's just the biggest, most important thing you can do. If you don't have any workplace savings program at all, I
Mhm.
think the most important thing to do is to try to replicate as much of that as you can inside of an IRA.
Mhm.
So you have to do a little more work, right? One of the most amazing things about a workplace savings plan is that it generally now, when you start working somewhere, they'll automatically enroll you. They'll automatically sign you up. They'll automatically invest you. The only thing you really need to do is check and see if they're taking out as much to start as you can afford to contribute. Are they taking you all the way up to the match, the maximum free
Right.
money level? Are they actually defaulting you in at 3%, which is really not enough? And if you can afford it, you should go in and shove that up to 5 or 10% if you can, right? So
Mhm.
you have to do a little bit of work, but a lot less work. If you don't have that, you have to find, I would recommend an online brokerage from a reputable national chain. And having spent, 30 years working at JP Morgan, I could have told you in my professional life that that's the best place to go and the only place to go. And you should, okay, any national reputation, name a whole bunch of firms, right, is going to have a roughly comparable offering for an introductory basic IRA where you can automatically have your money taken out the day your paycheck hits or an automatic payroll deduction. That's the best way to do it. So you don't have to decide every month, am I going to do this? So assuming you have a steady job and a steady paycheck that's predictable, you should set that up and automate it.
Mm.
It will take a little bit of online clicking, but it's not that hard to do. You should look for a low fee. I recommend at least under 0.5%, or often it's called 50 basis point, 0.5%. You can find things that are lower depending on how much you're contributing and how often and regular that is. Often, if you automate these things, you'll get much lower fees
Mhm.
because the companies know if you stick with it, that money will grow.
Mhm.
Um, and I would recommend strongly replicating what a 401k plan would do, which is to invest in a target date fund, which will automatically,
Mhm.
used to be what I do for a living, so I'm a little biased, but it will automatically make the investment decisions for you. So you don't have to spend a lot of time worrying about whether I'm making the right or wrong decision.
Mm.
Because if you're 25 or 30 years old, you want to be in 85, 90, 95% stocks and just not worry about it. So that's the great way to do it. It's a little more complicated if you don't have a steady paycheck because it may be a lot more uncomfortable for you to figure out what that level of savings should be. Um, and you will have to go in maybe every month and make a decision how much I should be putting in. And so maybe it's you have an account that everything goes into, and then you move it into short-term savings when you have some extra, and you go in there once a month and take the deduction from that. I think I think, one of the benefits of this new economy we're in is there are a lot of places, in a lot of ways, people can monetize their experience and, gig or earn all kinds of different careers. I'm kind of gigging myself now, but it makes it a lot harder to do things that really require consistent over and over contributions, right? So
Yeah.
I do think it's a lot more challenging, and I think it requires a lot more. Um, I hate talking about willpower, but it takes a lot more conscious effort because it's probably not safe if your income bounces around a lot to really automate it.
Yeah.
So that one, I think you just have to maybe look back every 3 months or every 6 months and say, what's my cushion, right? How much is in my cushion? Do I have that proverbial 3 to 6 months emergency savings program? Maybe if you're completely gigging, you maybe should push that up a little higher and then say above that, I can maybe afford to invest that.
So that's great for people that have a job and they have an employer, either taking advantage of the 401k or these other options that you mentioned if they don't have a plan like that. But what if you're self-employed or you're thinking about being self-employed, quitting your job and becoming a TikTok influencer or some such thing as that, as you said in some of your materials. What does the self-employed person do as far as these long-term savings for retirement?
So I think, again, that self-employed person has to really think long and hard about the sustainability of what they're doing. And
Mhm.
there are actually some incredibly powerful structures. IRAs have maximum contribution levels that are actually kind of low. It's $7,000. That may sound like a ton of money, but if you're earning more than 50 or $60,000 a year, contributing $7,000 a year is maybe not quite enough as you go to really help you save enough for retirement. If you're earning more than that, significantly more than that, you're not going to be able to get those tax advantage savings. There's something called a single employer plan that's a
Mhm.
SEP 401k or a SEP IRA that actually lets you contribute a lot more of your income into one of these retirement plans. That is maybe aspirational if you're in your 20s and 30s, unless you really are extremely well paid. But if you're making more than, let's say, 100, 150, $200,000 a year, that really ought to be in your line of sight as a way to start really making some significant contributions. You don't get the match, but you can actually take a much greater percentage of your income and save it than you can with that sort of IRA ceiling of $7,000 is, in percentage terms, again, if you're making $100,000, is only 7%. If you're making $200,000, it's 3.5%. That's not enough to be saving. So looking at some of these alternate structures is powerful. Another thing to consider if you are seeing very volatile income, right? You never really know. Maybe you're a creative person and you are an actor or a musician or an artist and you have good years and bad years. It's okay to save your money and invest it in a non-tax advantaged account,
Mhm.
especially if you've already maxed out on your IRA. If you're worried about needing the money in the future, because the trick with something like an IRA or a 401k is you pay a big tax penalty if you take it out early. So you have to pay income tax on that, and you have to pay a 10% sort of early withdrawal penalty. So you really want to be fairly sure that you're going to leave that money alone until you're at least 59 and a half, ideally longer. So for some people, right, getting the money to work and earning that compound return is fabulous. If you are worried that you might need it in 5 or 10 years, right? Maybe the IRA structure, even though you get all those great tax-free compounding advantages, that might be a little risky. So another thing to think about is a high yield savings account, especially with interest rates as high as they are today, or a conservative investment account that maybe has 20 or 30% in stocks. That way, if you need the
Right.
money, you don't risk all of it, having been down 40%, if you need to sell it and use that money. But it's also growing while you let it be. So I think taxable accounts, right, you shouldn't ignore those just
Mhm.
because maybe you can't save enough in an IRA or you're worried about the volatility of your income.
Well, as a self-employed person myself for over 20 years, I can tell you that, that's something that I've looked at, the trying to fully fund a Roth IRA, but also having an SEP, and there are great
Hmm.
tax advantages to an SEP. That's basically a self-employed person's 401k. There are no
Yep.
matching funds, but you do get the tax advantage. You just have to pay taxes on it when you take it out, and you have to take it out at some point. There are going to be mandatory withdrawals once you get old enough, but that's certainly something to think about.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. The government does want their tax
yeah,
dollar
they
back.
they want
They
it
will tax you
eventually,
on the way in or the way out. Yeah.
either the way in or the way out. So great information and ideas for people in their 20s and 30s. We mentioned earlier that you're coming out with a book. When does that book come out?
That comes out on March 12th, actually. So early March, mid-March.
Okay,
And you can find more about it on my website and lester.com, ANNELESTER.com. You can also take a quiz on my website about actually identifying your money type and getting a couple of tips on how
good.
to manage your own spending if that's one of your challenges.
Now it's coming out in March, but can listeners pre-order it if they want to
Absolutely.
get in line now?
Yep. It's on all the websites. You can find links on my website as well, but it's everywhere that you might find a book. Uh, whether it's online or at your local bookstore, you can go ahead and pre-order that.
Mhm. And so I'll put those links in the show notes, folks, so you can get that information. But just briefly, what can people expect to learn from reading your book?
Well, it's full of a whole bunch of tips, just like we've been talking about today. The other thing I really think is important, and I think it's especially important for people in their 20s and 30s today, is to understand that saving money isn't easy for most people. And I think it's even harder today than it was, for us when we were in our 20s and 30s. And let me tell you, I stank at it. So it, it wasn't easy for me then either. But I think because of the way so much of our economy has moved online and there's so many more ways to compare yourself to other people, it's just ratcheted up the sort of FOMO and sort of pressure to spend on the one hand and made it easier to do on the other. So I think it's tough. And one of the things I really try to do in my book is to help people understand both the sort of structural societal issues, like I just mentioned, that make it harder to save, but also our own brain wiring, right? Like that thing where your brain doesn't recognize your future self as yourself, right? Or this the pain of not doing something you want right now for the future, right? Or the fear of loss that we all have when we look at the markets going down. So I think understanding some of those sort of brain wiring impulses makes it easier for people to understand and maybe to forgive themselves if they've been beating themselves up for not doing this the right way, but also understand why they behave a certain way and maybe to build some of those hacks or guardrails in around their own spending and investing that will make it easier to do over time and make them much more successful.
Great. Some terrific information for our listeners, and to check out her book and get that pre-order in. I'm sure they'll go quickly. But
Hope
thanks
you're
for
right.
coming on the
We'll
show,
see.
Ann. And
Thank you so much.
all righty.